Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. With the second phase of Wuthering Waves version 2.0, we have another brand new 5-star character, Roccia, evidently. Okay, I find it pretty funny that her name is literally just Rock in Italian. Anyway, you'll learn everything you need to know about this Italian rock in today's ultimate guide video.
Mamma mia, avanti. The world is our stage. Time for some crowd work. I'll warm up the...
Roccia is an interesting character with her goofy ghost buddy who partners with her to wreak havoc on her enemies. Roccia is a 5-star Havoc character who focuses on providing utility to the team via grouping enemies, deals some non-negligible damage, and provides significant outro buffs to a teammate. As usual, we'll go through her kit and rotation, her echoes and stats, weapons, sequences, teams, showcases, and of course, my opinion on Roccia at the end of the video.
Mamma mia, avanti. Figurati.
Quick note, this video was filmed on the media server and things may be subject to change upon the official release. Please check the comments below to see if anything changed. Fortunately, Roccia's kit is a bit simpler than many of her peers, starting off with her basic attacks. These are useful for generating her forte, with her B4 generating the most forte. You can also hold her basic attack to generate forte, and if you have at least 100 forte or one of her 3 forte bars, via this hold attack she'll enter Beyond Imagination state, where she goes high into the air. While in Beyond Imagination state, she can now spend 100 forte to do these silly real fantasy bounce attacks. Resonance skill groups enemies and generates 100-ish forte and puts her in Beyond Imagination state. You can do these funny bounce attacks up to 3 times if you have the full 300 forte. These bounce attacks are important not only because they continue to group enemies, but they also generate a lot of concerto for her, with the first bounce generating 10 concerto, the second generating 16 concerto, and the third generating a whopping 25 concerto. As such, she's incentivized to get a full 300 forte to perform 3 consecutive bounces for maximum concerto generation. Up next we have her Liberation,
The world is our stage.
which does a bit of damage and, more importantly, provides an attack buff to the entire team based on her crit rate. Once Roccia has 70% or more crit rate, she maxes out this 200 attack buff, so you'll want to build her to 70% or more crit rate. This buff also lasts for a very long 30 seconds, so you'll have great uptime on this. Finally, her outro skill amplifies Havoc damage by 20% and basic attack damage by 25% for the next resonator for 14 seconds. However, you will lose the buff if you swap off of it, so do keep that in mind. Another aspect of her outro skill is that she replaces your utility item with her inherent skill Super Attractive Magic Box. The on-field character can activate it, where it deals some negligible Havoc damage, but more importantly, helps group enemies for a reasonable amount of time. Lastly, her intro skill is pretty basic, just generating forte, but with one additional important detail, being that she can immediately follow her intro skill with, by simply performing her intro skill and basic 4, she'll be at 2 forte. And that's pretty much it. That's essentially all you need to know about her kit. She's a comparatively simple character to pick up and use, which is honestly a nice breath of fresh air. For her skill priority, I would focus on getting her inherent skill Super Attractive Magic Box. While she does deal non-negligible damage, she's not gonna set any DPS records, but for her damage skill priority, I would level her forte, then her liberation, followed by her skill, basics, and lastly her intro skill. As for her rotation, this is a great one to get started with. First, intro her onto the field, and use a basic attack right after, which as a reminder skips immediately to her basic 4. Then use her skill, bounce 3 times, use her liberation, then echo, and then outro. You can use her liberation after her basic 4 if you like as well. Anyway, as we can see, she's a comparatively simple character to use, and this cookie cutter rotation has a very reasonable 6.74 second field time. There are definitely other options like double swap intro list variations, but hopefully this will serve as a great starting point for you to start using Roccia.
Time for some crowd work. I'll warm up with...
Up next are Roccia's echoes, and stats. Roccia seemingly has 2 main set options, the Moonlit Clouds and the new Midnight Veil. The Midnight Veil for the uninitiated increases Havoc damage by 10%, and upon outro deals 480% Havoc damage to nearby enemies, and grants the incoming Resonator a 15% Havoc damage bonus. This, in conjunction with the Nightmare Impermanence Heron, actually ends up dealing a non-negligible amount of damage. Because Roccia actually deals non-negligible damage, using the Moonlit actually causes Roccia to lose nearly a third of her damage, which lowers the overall team damage output in comparison to Moonlit's slightly larger buffs to Camellia. However, as we can see, in the end we're talking about 2 to 3% less team damage, which honestly isn't the biggest deal in the world, so yeah, it's fine honestly. As for the main stats, you'll want crit rate for the 4 cost and double havoc for the 3 costs. As we can see, an attack percent 3 cost drops Roccia's damage by about 5%, so it's recommended to eventually farm double havoc 3 costs for her. Finally, you can equip an energy recharge 3 cost if you're struggling with getting her liberation up in time, but usually a few energy recharge substat rolls is enough for her. For the Moonlit, I generally prefer the Heron in the main slot for its buff, although you can of course use the Turtle as well. As for the Midnight set, overall I recommend the Nightmare Heron, as that thing provides 12% havoc damage, 12% heavy damage, deals solid damage, and is quick swappable. There's also Lorelei, which is fairly competitive. It's just missing 12% heavy damage, but that's not a huge deal, so if you have a good Lorelei, feel free to use that too. Now the next thing to keep in mind is her crit rate target of 70% to maximize her team-wide 200 attack buff. With her signature gauntlets, the Tragica Melody, you only need 3 on average crit rolls to reach over 70%. However, for any other gauntlets that don't have crit rate for a substat like the Abyss Surge, you'll need all 5 of your echoes to have slightly above average crit rate rolls on them to break 70%. Another alternative is to actually use the 44111 setup with double crit rate. This does hurt Roccia's damage a lot, and it's not recommended for the long term, but it's a usable temporary option as you farm a 43311 set with the crit rate subs on them. Now it is worth mentioning that Shorekeeper's 12.5% crit rate actually does count towards Roccia's crit rate for her attack buff. So if you're using Roccia with Shorekeeper, you only need 1 to 4 rolls on average, depending on your weapon choice. As for energy recharge, I found that around 15 to 30% to be all I needed. For example, 15% felt fine with Shorekeeper and around 25% was fine with Verena. But as always, energy recharge is a moving target, so you may need to experiment a bit depending on the fight and your team and to see what works for your setup. For substat priority, I recommend crit rate until you have 70% crit rate, then energy recharge until you hit your target of about 15 to 30% depending on your team, crit damage and attack percent, and lastly heavy attack damage is fine too.
Mamma mia! Avanti! Figurati!
Alright, we've made it to the weapons, and if you've been playing Wuthering Waves for a while, you'll know what to expect here. Her signature weapon, the Tragica Melody, is her best option and significantly better than her best free-to-play option, the Abyss Surge. And of course, the 4-star options tend to be, well, rather copium. However, there might be some shenanigans with the Mercado and her Sequence 1 that can significantly shorten her rotation, but yeah, it's the usual story of her signature being the clear best option. It is worth mentioning that if you have Shangli Yao's signature weapon, the Verity's Handle, it's pretty decent on Roccia and has crit rate as a substat, making it much easier to properly build up your Roccia to 70% crit rate, but you'll probably be using that on your Shangli Yao instead. But yeah, here's the chart. It is missing some of the 4-star options, but as far as I'm aware, they're all notably worse than her signature weapon.
Time for some crowd work! I wanna switch.
Up next we have teams, and fortunately for us guide makers, she's actually straightforward here as well. Thanks to her 20% havoc damage outro buff and 25% basic attack damage amplify, she is perfect for Camellia, who happens to do a lot of havoc damage and also a lot of basic attack damage. It is worth noting that Camellia's rotations are on the longer side, usually around 17 to 20 seconds, and Roccia's 14 to 15 second buffs do fall off towards the end of Camellia's rotation. Now overall, Roccia is a bit of an upgrade from Sequence 6 Sanhua, which is actually impressive in its own right considering just how incredible Sanhua is. But if you're looking for a massive upgrade, Roccia is more of a modest upgrade over Sanhua. Of course, for the healer slot, Shorekeeper is overall the best option for Camellia, but Verena, as always, is also a great choice, and Baizhi is a usable alternative. Now we also have two other Havoc DPS characters, Danjin and Havoc Rover. And great news, Roccia works just fine with them as well. Finally, while not very recommended, if you want to use Roccia as a main DPS, you can try her out with Mortefi and Shorekeeper. I had limited success with this, and again, it's not a strong team and I don't recommend it, but it is a fun team if you want to use your Roccia to hit a bit harder than most might expect.
Mamma mia! Avanti! Figurati!
Up next, we have Roccia's sequences and investment priority. Since this section always has the worst retention, here is Roccia's true form. Roccia's sequence 1 shortens her rotation by about 1 second, allowing her to skip her B4. This speeds up her rotation from 6.74 seconds to 5.73 seconds, which is around 15% faster, and increases her personal DPS by around 13%. It also provides her super armor during her bounce attacks. Roccia's sequence 2 is her big one, providing up to 40% havoc damage to the entire team, which over a couple rotations increases her own and her havoc team's DPS by around 14%. Sequence 3 provides 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage to Roccia, which increases her personal DPS and makes her easier to build to reach that 70% crit rate. Sequences 4 through 6 further increases her damage, and by sequence 6 she'll be doing some pretty solid damage. Personally, I would actually prioritize her sequence 1 and 2 because those will improve your team's damage output significantly. However, her weapon is much cheaper due to it being a guarantee when you pull on it, and is still a reasonable choice because of that.
Time for some crowd work!
Okay, I've got a few runs for you guys with Roccia, and the first one is her supporting a Camellia team. And we can see here that, of course, we have Shorekeepers, typical rotation at the beginning. And I'm just going to do a pretty simple playstyle where you just kind of do one character at a time. Because frankly, I find it easier to just do this as well. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, most players probably play like this, but I'm sure there are some interesting quick swap scenarios that you can absolutely integrate. But we're going to go ahead and use the spin to win Camellia playstyle because that playstyle is just the role that, you need for Roccia's rock. Roccia's? Oh man, I'm still going to say that name wrong all the time. But anyway, here we go. We are now just doing the typical rotation, and we are indeed able to pull it off in time in order to swap back to Shorekeeper for her to do her big boom explosion thing, which does a bit of damage. But we can see this team flows very nicely because of Camellia's rather long field time, and Roccia's not like super fast field time, but the field times end up working out just fine to be roughly within the 30 seconds that's needed for Shorekeeper in order for her to, still pull off her explosion thing. We can see some pretty decent numbers, 118,000 on Camellia's Liberation, and I believe she does around 220,000 with her Forte right there. So yeah, very solid damage with 7,000 ticks per twirl. So yeah, I mean, I think some of Roccia's buffs definitely fell off near the end of that, but as we can see, some very good damage considering this is a level 100 monkey with multiple waves. This actually makes, this team did pretty well, all things considered. And I still remember back in the early versions where it was only the monkey, but now they've decided to add a couple waves before the monkey, really demonstrating, well, just how far we've come in terms of the amount of damage that we're expected to do. But yeah, anyway, just another spin to win rotation should be able to cleanly take it out with another massive 220,000 Forte nuke. Now, a bit more free-to-play friendly team with Sequence 6 Danjin with the Emerald of Genesis. And I did take this team over to the slightly easier Fallacy of No Return, who's only level 90, because I gotta be completely honest, I am so rusty with Danjin. Oh my gosh, I used her the most back during closed beta, if that tells you how long ago. Like, I used her a lot. Like, I used her a little bit on release, but recently I haven't used her in a while. But I think roughly how it goes is you tag the enemy with a flower, and then you go for her kind of bigger heavy attack skills and Forte nukes, as well as her Liberation. So I'm probably playing her like absolute dookie, but you guys can let me know down in the comments below. But yeah, so this team works obviously perfectly fine. In this case, obviously, you're just supporting Danjin instead of Camellia, and you can definitely incorporate more of Dunjin's normal attacks instead of like more of her skills or more of her heavy attacks, because Roccia does indeed buff provide the basic attack amplify. And that is another perfectly valid way to play Dunjin, is to try to squeeze out a bit more normal attacks than you normally would without, Roccia's buffs or that type of basic attack amplify. But either way, we are doing just fine. We're able to take this out with the 4-star Dunjin and with plenty of time remaining, over 22 seconds in this much easier section of the tower. Now, this next one is an S0R1 main DPS Roccia, and before you guys get upset at me for recommending a not really meta build, I have it right there. This is fun, but not really recommended. But if you do want to have some fun, make your Roccia do some decent damage, well, I guess this is a team for you. You can use more Tefi to provide the heavy attack amplify, because a plurality of Roccia's damage is the heavy attack. Now, on this account, I am indeed using the Nightmare Crownless, because I really didn't have many other options. In fact, actually, the echoes aren't very good here. So there's a lot of room to improve, actually, for her damage with this setup. But yeah, just a funny setup. And you actually can extend Roccia's on-field rotation a bit because of how long Shorekeeper's, liberation lasts and stuff. So you can actually get out about 6 of her bounce attacks in a rotation. And also, in this case, Mortefi's weapon isn't even leveled. But yeah, he's using the Concerto gun, but unfortunately it's not really well leveled. So, Mortefi's missing a lot of damage too. But yeah, a somewhat viable team. I have to be completely honest. I struggled to complete the middle tower level 100 bosses with main DPS Roccia, but the side tower was not a problem for her for this main DPS setup. So if you want to have some fun, this is an interesting team to try.
Mamma mia, avanti, figurati.
Overall, if you're looking to rock and roll, well, at least now you got the rock with Roccia. She's a very solid secondary DPS character that provides Havoc and basic attack damage amplify, which is quite valuable for all the current Havoc characters. Granted, she fulfills a very similar role to Sanhua and takes more field time than Sanhua, but provides a lot more utility through grouping the enemy and a larger buff for Havoc characters. So if you like what you see here, well, she's a decent pickup. And if there ends up being more AoE focused content, or content where we need to keep multiple enemies grouped for longer, her grouping utility will be very valuable. Let me know what you think about Roccia down in the comments below. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.